Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Noemi Ndiaye. I am an assistant professor in the English department here at UChicago and the happy founder of the Black Baroque Project. I'm delighted to introduce today's event, which was made possible by the generosity of the Division of the Humanities here at UChicago and by the sponsorship of the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture. I also want to thank doctoral candidate Rachel Willis, our amazing manager of the Black Baroque Project. And of course, I want to thank our distinguished guests, whom I will introduce in a second, Wole Lagunju and Lia Markey. The second season of the Black Baroque Project programming platforms Black identifying contemporary visual artists who work with, sometimes against, and always through Baroque aesthetics as they reckon with our own cultural and political moment. Those artists take on the challenge of reworking an aesthetic culture that participated in the historical rise of new racial formations in early modern Europe that grew the roots of modern anti-Black racism. Artists like Wole Lagunju ask the million-dollar question, and actually it's a set of three questions. What do we make of the toxic beauty of anti-Black Renaissance artworks? On what terms can we love such a body of work? And what can revisiting that visual archive today do for us as we keep striving towards liberation? The Black Baroque Project wants to hear from artists who reckon with the complexity of those questions, and we curate conversations between such artists and scholars who are best equipped and positioned to help us illuminate those artists' world. Today, we are fortunate to receive Wole Lagunju. Wole Lagunju is a 1986 graduate of Fine Arts and Graphic Design at the University of Ife, now Obafemi Awolowo University in Nigeria. Lagunju's hybrid paintings of traditional Gelede masks, which are juxtaposed with images of the modern woman in the Western world, redefine the forms and philosophies of Yoruba visual art and design. He reimagines and transforms cultural icons appropriated from the Dutch Golden Age, the Elizabethan, as well as the 1950s and 1960s Euro-American eras. Lagunju's cultural references, mined from the eras of colonization and decolonization of the African continent, critique the racial and social structures of the 19th century, while evoking commentaries on power, femininity, and womanhood. Wole Lagunju has exhibited widely in Nigeria and the United States, Trinidad, and Germany. Recent exhibitions include Yoruba Remixed at Ebony Curated Gallery in Cape Town. That was a solo exhibition in 2018. Wole Lagunju, African Diaspora Artist and Transnational Visuality at James Madison University in Harrisonburg, Virginia, also a solo exhibition in 2014, as well as Womanscape, Race, Gender, and Sexuality in African Art at University of Austin, Texas in 2011. Wole was awarded a prestigious Philip Ravenhill Fellowship by UCLA in 2006 and a Paula Krasner Award in 2009. He lives in the United States. Our respondent today is Leah Markey. Leah Markey is the director of the Center for Renaissance Studies at the Newberry Library. She received her PhD from the University of Chicago, and her major publications include a monograph titled Imagining the Americas in Medici Florence, 2016, as well as two edited volumes, one co-edited with Liz Horodowicz, The New World in Early Modern Italy, 1492 to 1750, which was published in 2017, and the second one, Renaissance Invention, Stratinus's Nova Reperta, 2020. She teaches at the University of Chicago and Northwestern University. She has held fellowships at the Folger Library, the Warburg Institute, the Villa I Tatti, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and the Herzog August Bibliothek. Currently, Leah is collaborating on an exhibition and an edited volume provisionally entitled Seeing Race Before Race, Visual Culture and the Racial Matrix in the Pre-Modern World, which I have the good fortune of co-editing with her and which is forthcoming with ACMRS, the Arizona Center for Medieval and Renaissance Studies Press in spring 2023. Thank you both. Thank you, Leah. Thank you, Wole, for joining us today and for helping us immerse ourselves in the wonderful world of Wole's work. Rachel, this would be a good time to drop the link to Wole's website in the chat for viewers who might be curious to see more of Wole's work as they hear him speak. And I will now yield the floor to Wole and Leah. They will converse for about 15 minutes, after which they will take questions from you all, for about 30 minutes. So please ask your questions in the Q&A box. I believe that the chat is deactivated, so the Q&A box is really the place to go for you to get your questions asked and answered. Thank you, and see you all shortly.
Thank you, Noemi, and thank you all for being here. It's exciting to see some familiar names here. I'm really honored to be here to learn more about Wole's incredible body of work. I will admit I have never interviewed a living artist. I study artworks and artists from the Renaissance, so this is especially exciting for me. And in just a couple minutes here, I'm going to just introduce you to a few of the works that I would like us to focus on in our conversation today. And I'm not going to say very much. Noemi already gave us a wonderful introduction to Wole as an artist, but I just wanted to highlight a couple works, and I think I'll show them now, and then we'll talk for a little bit and probably return to the PowerPoint to do a little bit more analysis along the way. But you see that this is a work from 2016, which is a figure in Elizabethan dress with the Gelede mask. And this is a work that includes this bright palette, incredible detail, and this intense contrast between the mask and the costume. Another work from 2014, a little bit earlier, incredible title. I'm hoping to ask Wole a bit more about his titles. This gives you a sense of the dimension, which we'll also understand a little bit better when we see him in his space today. But these are very large scale paintings, which they're bigger than the actual paintings that they are quoting from, which is fascinating. So what's interesting, and something I've been thinking about a lot over the last weeks as I've been studying his works in more depth, is how through this process of quoting these paintings from the late 16th century, he's really transforming the actual meaning of the works themselves, or the originals. And I'm curious to talk to him a little bit about this as well. This is actually something, if you've read Mika Ball's quoting Caravaggio, really at the heart of her study, the way that images are manipulated when they are used and quoted. This work, I'm especially interested in this Parody of Vanity, which is a new work from 2021, which is looking towards, I think, Titian, but I'm curious to talk to Wole more about his sources for this. And then this work, Empire, which is especially fascinating, this profile portrait with an English crown, which has been manipulated and using a Nigerian, I think. But again, I'll be curious to talk to Wole about the fabrics being used in this crown here. And then I also wanted to introduce you to another type of work he does, which is looking towards the 1960s. I love this psychedelia and the colors and the patterns. So hopefully we will also have some time to think about these recent works as well. So I might just stop there, and I'll put my screen down and I'll ask Wole just a first basic question. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your upbringing in Nigeria and your formation as an artist, Wole. And good to see you. Thanks.
Good to see you too. Well, I was born in a city in Nigeria, in Western Nigeria, called Oshogu. Now, Oshogu is quite famous. It's famous for an art school. This art school is called the Oshogu Art School. The Oshogu Art School started with the efforts of some expatriates from Germany. And I grew up in the midst of these activities, like in the early 70s when I was growing up. I was born in the 60s, actually. But growing up in the 70s, I became more aware of this art school. At the same time, there was a gallery in Oshogu next to my father's pharmacy shop. So I grew up visiting the gallery, being mentored by some of these artists who are still active today. So that was how I grew up in Oshogu. And after I left Oshogu, I went to the university. I studied in Ife. Ife is not quite that far from Oshogu, but I studied to be a graphic artist in Ife. And at the same time, after leaving Ife in 1986, I moved to Lagos, a much more cosmopolitan city, and I worked in journalism. I started a small business of my own, and when I couldn't cope with that, I moved into journalism. I worked in the Daily Times, which is the biggest newspaper in West Africa. And after I left Daily Times, I moved into advertising. I worked in advertising in Lagos for some years. Afterwards, I went to Germany. I spent a year in Germany. Then I came back to Nigeria and became a full-time painter. That's been my journey so far.
So how did you make this transition to be a full-time painter? Is this something, were you, when you were a journalist, when you were a graphic artist, were you longing to do your own work? Or?
Yes, actually, yeah. I was, like I said, I grew up in Oshogu, and I was really interested in paintings and drawing and stuff like that. And there were some very popular artists at that time, like Chief Twins 77, like Moreno Oyelami, like Nike, the famous batik artists from Nigeria. So all that time, I was really interested in that. And I think that was the reason I went to school to actually study art in the first place. So when I was in school, I wanted to become a painter. But I thought again that being a graphic artist will make me a more rounded artist, will enable me to be able to make publications, will enable me to put my thoughts together graphically. And in the future, that will really add to my experience.
Yeah, it reminds me quite a little bit of Andy Warhol's formation. So yeah, and when you look at your work, you can see this background in graphic arts. And how has your training, or your work, I should say, as a graphic artist or designer, illustrator, how has that affected your process as an artist or your conception of production?
Well, it's made me before I used to work and make publications, journals, and stuff like that. And I could put those pages together graphically. I could insert illustrations. I could put everything together. And at the same time, being a graphic artist introduced me to the computer arts, to using software like Photoshop and such. So I was able to combine that with my paintings and arrive at what I do today.
Yeah. So what's great is that it looks like we're in your studio right now.
Exactly.
And so we're seeing the works behind you, and it looks as if they're unfinished. Is that right?
Those one's unfinished. This one is unfinished.
This one's unfinished. That one's finished. So what is your process exactly? Do you still work with a computer and create an image, how does it all come together?
Yeah, actually, I work with images from editorial fashion and photography, and I use the computer, and I use a tablet at the same time. One of these tablets that animators use. So I make my sketches from that. I would like to tell you that for a lot of years before, I used to paint freely. But now I found out that my process is better if I have a sketch of what I want to do, mainly because of the kind of reference images that I use. So it's better for me now to actually have a sketch to be able to place my masks onto the bodies of my subjects. You know, I can't really do that freely. So sometimes I use the computer to make sketches and have a preconceived image of what I want to do.
Okay, that's fascinating. So I have a lot of more specific questions about works of art. And so maybe we'll move a little bit from process into to meaning. I'm going to just bring back the screen and share this quote from Dr. Charles Gore, who wrote this beautiful article about your work. And he writes, he skillfully mobilizes the genres of portrait painting to his own purposes to playfully decenter and deconstruct the narratives of power that seek to legitimate inequality through imaginative and vivid compositions with their deft and imaginative handling of brilliant color. Centering the Gelede mask at the heart of the iconography, it gazes out at the viewer to pose fundamental questions as to heterogeneity, diversity, gendering, and the exercises of power to the viewer. So I would love to hear what you think about this. I'm struck by this idea that there's something playful in your work, but that it's also just incredibly powerfully dealing with race and gender. So is this an accurate description of these images?
Well, I would somehow like to contest that aspect of playfulness. A lot of people say that some of the elements in my works are playful. It might seem like that, but that actually stems from the iconography that I use. For example, the iconography on the Gelede masks themselves might seem playful, but they have powerful messages associated with them. So in a sense, I would contest the playful description. So, I mean, that's the only thing. But in the other terms of what he has said, and I remember talking to him on the streets of London when he conducted this interview with me. The other facts that he has stated are actually true, because the configuration, the configuration of the painting itself is centered mostly around the mask and the kind of powerful imagery and metaphysical as well as visual meaning that one strives to portray.
Essentially, you're taking a portrait like this Hilliard portrait of Queen Elizabeth, and adding a mask. Can you tell us a little bit more about the Gelede masks and how they function in Nigeria and Yoruba, but also then how they're being transferred and what their meaning is when they are entering the space of Elizabethan England?
Okay, well,
big question. Yeah.
The narrative is a counter narrative, and I'll talk briefly about the Gelede mask itself. The Gelede mask is a mask that is worn by men in Yoruba culture to essentially, and very importantly, to celebrate women. Gelede celebrates the physical endowment of women. And at the same time, Gelede celebrates the supernatural, the metaphysical, and the awesome powers of women. And in a way, there is no social well-being in Yoruba society if one doesn't recognize the power that women wield in Yoruba society. And That is essentially why I use that mask. And my experience with this mask even predates what I'm actually doing right now. I think in 1995, I was commissioned by the German Cultural Center in Lagos to design a mask, a poster for a play. And I chose this Gelede mask because there's an element of satire, there's an element of powerful imagery, and there's an element of the subject and the meaning of the mask themselves. So they are very powerful images, and they are very powerful performances in Yoruba culture. So I chose that mask to essentially draw parallels between women in traditional Yoruba society and women in the Euro-Americas. So, and when I take these masks at the same time and put them on these faces from another culture, I'm using the mask to question gender and power and race. So that's what I'm trying to do. But one essential thing about the masks themselves is that there's an element of humor, there's an element of satire, which I use. And this satire is to actually contest the validity of the images that one sees in Western culture, the colonizing culture. So I use this mask to question these hegemonic spaces.
And so you're placing a mask that's usually worn by a male onto this female ruler, and you're then endowing her with a whole nother meaning as well.
Exactly, exactly. And what I do, because these masks are worn by men essentially, but it's about women, and it's about drawing parallels between women from different cultures, and it's about creating hybridized creatures that you don't normally come across because they fuse elements of two different cultures together. And when I started to see these images, when I first started to make drawings of these images, because I was actually doing graphic images and graphic drawings before I proceeded to the paintings. One thing that drew me to them to essentially make them into paintings is the kind of countercultural discourse that I felt was being excavated. At the same time also, I saw that these creatures could bring about new conversations about race, about gender, about sexuality, which is very essential in Gelede performances. And these new conversations, I just wanted to stir something up, to bring about something new, and which will actually have some kind of inclusiveness. It could include my audience from anywhere they could be from. So that was why I began to do that, to cut it short.
As a traditionally trained art historian in the US, I will admit that one of my first thoughts was about this very polemical work by Picasso, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, and the Cubist use of the African mask. And I can't resist asking you about this, what your thoughts are about this period, the use of the mask, and do you feel like you're in dialogue with a work like this? Let me know.
But not essentially, because something at the back of my mind at the same time when I was making these paintings was this thing about repatriation. And I think when it comes to that, we have to think about the intellectual rights of Africans themselves. Picasso never admitted how much he was influenced by African sculpture. And one thing at the back of my mind at that time was that I saw many of these masks in the Western museums. A lot of collections display these masks. And I was interested in reclaiming, I was interested in reclaiming, in a way, my heritage. Because I said to myself, I would like to include these objects in my work. I would like people to see that we, maybe this time, Yoruba people, we have not left these objects and forgotten all about them. And I felt that I could bring about that discourse. I mean, that was a long time ago. That was like 2012, when this thing about taking all these objects back to Africa was just in its infant stages. So I wanted to reclaim my heritage in a way. So in asking that question about Picasso, I'm more interested in reclaiming my heritage from Picasso. I'm not interested in engaging in a dialogue with them.
Yeah, that makes sense. And that's a beautiful way of describing it. And so this work from 2014 is early in your conception of using the mask and reclaiming that heritage. And I wanted to ask you in that regard also about, this is one of your older titles are long, your newer titles are short, and we'll look at those in a second. But tell me a little bit about this title of Race, Mythology, and Redefinitions of Storytelling.
Well, at that time, I felt that all this talk about race is just myth. One culture being superior, one culture other being superior, one culture being backward, not as good as the other one. So I just felt that all these discussions about supremacy is just a myth, actually. And I wanted to redefine, in my own little way, I wanted to redefine that aspect of the storytelling. I wanted to do that. So it's just something that came to me at that time to redefine. One interesting thing that I would like to point out again is that in Gelede, the Gelede performance itself recognizes the Caucasian other. So you find imagery, Caucasian imagery in Gelede performances. And I think that came about by colonization, when people were being colonized and people started to take these bits of imagery and started to include it in their visual art. So I wanted to actually have that at the back of my mind, and I wanted to really sharpen that and redefine it. So these were some of the images that came about due to that kind of thinking at that time.
Yeah, and this one is incredibly striking because she has this very pink skin, and the mask is different here. And there's also a feather in the mask.
Yes, yes.
And can you tell us a little bit more about the conception of this mask and how it's different from the others?
Yeah, I thought that this was kind of striking because the mask is not quite traditional. It's a contemporary mask, and it has sunglasses.
Yeah.
So when I started this, making this my pictures, I told someone that I was interested in a discourse at that time. And the discourse was about the marginalization of women of color in fact. So that was how I started, So I began to see that I could question the narrative by superimposing these masks onto iconic images of women in Western culture. So at that time, I didn't want to change the skin color because I was interested in critiquing these images of power and gender in Western art. So I didn't want to change the color. I wanted to bring about some kind of discourse that are these women wearing these masks, or are they being superimposed on them?
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to see that.
Oh, this is just to show how you're engaging with these portraits of Elizabeth.
Yes.
But I wanted to then, I mean, in the recent years, you've been dealing with male figures, and I'm super intrigued by this one in particular. To me, it brought to mind right away this Titian portrait. I'm not sure if that was your actual source, but what happens now when you put the mask on a male figure? What's going on here now?
Yeah, what's going on is that this essentially is actually an Ife mask. I mean, sometimes I do moving between these masks themselves, and I actually use the Ife masks. These are bronze masks that are depictions of the past kings of a town called Ife, Ile Ife. Ile Ife is meant to be the cradle of the human race. That's what they believe. So that mask is actually a bronze Ife mask. And I do that sometimes to actually reframe the identity of the Black male, to create a new sense of identity, and sometimes to insert this imagery of the Black other into the Western narrative. You know, and I was reading sometimes about images of Black people being omitted in Western art. So in a way, I'm trying to reinsert, in my own way, to reinsert or to insert, as the case may be, images of the Black other and fuse them and get some kind of interesting melange of conversations from that.
Yeah, I mean, so what was the function of these bronze masks? Are they still used today?
Yeah, well, not much of them exist again. And I think they are what you could refer to as death masks.
Oh, wow.
You know, like some of those masks that people make of the kings of Egypt and such.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of these masks were excavated in recent years. And these are the kind of objects that we're talking about being repatriated back to Africa.
Okay, that adds a whole nother layer of meaning then, yes.
Exactly,
Mm-hmm.
exactly. So there are layers and layers of meaning, because these masks themselves, they have spiritual meanings
Mm-hmm.
as well as physical meanings. You know, and we could go on and on about that.
Okay. So maybe we should look at this now, which doesn't have a mask in it, but it has this incredibly prominent crown. And you're fusing also a sort of, I feel like there's like a 1960s aesthetic here with his clothes, this incredible pattern background. And it seems to recall a crown like this. And then being a Renaissance scholar, I immediately think of the tradition of portrait painting from the 15th century of rulers, aristocratic male and female portraits. So, but the title empire.
Well, that crown is a Yoruba crown. And I wanted to focus on Yoruba crowns. I've been doing that for a little while now. And I wanted to focus on these Yoruba crowns that they might not look as grandiose as Western crowns, but they are equally as important. And the background is fleur de lis. I'm sure you must know that. But the Black male there is actually like an editorial image in contemporary fashion. So I wanted to, when I put all that together, I wanted to like reimagine the empire itself, the empire of the Yoruba race. You know, you might say I'm being kind of romantic about that, but not actually, you know, but I wanted to like contest and reassert my identity as a Yoruba person, that be it as it may, there's an empire, and people from that Yoruba race, they recognize themselves as also being an empire, which is comparable to any other empire, wherever you may see it. And I wanted that to infuse a sense of pride in a way for the young African or African-inspired, whether African-American inspired male, to look at that and have a sense of identity.
Oh, that's beautiful, because when I looked at this, I actually thought about colonization and subjugation. For you to say that this is about the pride of this empire of Yoruba, it gives it a completely different meaning in my mind now.
It's just about asserting your identity. It's just about contesting the space where you find yourself, which is
right.
something that happens to me every day. So I think in a way, making these pictures is actually a way for me to assert my identity.
Beautiful. Okay, we have a bunch of questions coming in, but I think I want to talk about a few more works with you before we turn to Q&A. Let's see what else I have here. So you made a brief mention actually just a few moments ago to your interest in inserting the Black into Western art and into the canon almost. So I wondered if you did want to speak a little bit about images that do exist, and there aren't very many. We have this incredible portrait of an African man, which is in the Rijksmuseum from the early 16th century. This is really something that Noemi and I are very interested in thinking about these days with this project we're working on. So I wonder if you have thought, do you ever think about engaging with images like this of Black Africans that were produced in the 16th century? I brought in this other one as well, actually. This one is really quite intense. This is one that was brought to our attention by Brandy Adams, and it's a double portrait that was recently sold at auction. We're not sure about the whereabouts of it. English school double portrait, and it has this intense caption on it as well. So yeah, we're just curious to hear your thoughts about these sorts of paintings, and they are now emerging, and they are being placed into conversation in art historical conversations, I should say, about race making in the 16th century, 17th century.
Yeah, I think it's very important for one to engage with these kind of images. But at the same time, my own kind of work that I do is mostly around contemporary African art, which I think it's something that's just coming up recently. So these images are quite fantastic, and I think one should engage with them. But at the same time, you could see that the one that you showed me, the man with the dog, you can draw a parallel between these kind of images and that's actually this one exactly. And I think if one takes these kind of pictures from that self-same period and just tweaks it just a little bit, puts a mask onto it or a face onto it, I think one is actually bringing about that conversation in a new way, which I think is equally striking. Does that answer a question?
Yeah, that's definitely answering a question, and you're making a very different statement by playing with these images of rulers, of aristocratic white males of the Western world. So then let's it'd be good to sort of conclude and think about the work you're doing right now, which is, it's also great that we can see them behind you. This is just from last year. And this one, for me, brought to mind right away this bust, which is in Berlin, of Nefertiti. And so tell us about what's going on now. We understand that you have a exhibition coming up as well. So if you could tell us a little bit about your current works and what you're working on at this moment and what you are working on, perhaps your future thinking.
Yes, I'm working on a lot of things, and I think my work is essentially grouped into themes and sub-themes. And I don't think I'm leaving any behind. Sometimes it's just like my mind is just drifting to a certain feature or features of a theme. Now, this one is quite interesting because I've been working on this thing of crowns for quite a while. And one can actually draw a parallel between the crown of the woman in the painting and the Egyptian figure. And what I'm trying to do is to actually bring the masks within the context of Yoruba traditional society. While one can say that the masks have some kind of independent existence, there is a supreme or kind of controlling force on these masks, which is the king. The king of the town is the one who has the ultimate authority on the masks. So I wanted to like bring into play, it's like theater. You want to bring into play the masks, then you want to bring into play the controlling authority on the masks, which will be the crowns of the kings. And essentially, if you look at this work, you will see that there are birds on the crown. Now, these birds symbolize women in traditional Yoruba society. And essentially, birds refer to the metaphysical powers of women. Women are referred to as Eleye. Eleye means the power of birds, which is the power of the woman. So in my recent paintings, I'm exploring and interrogating the space of the crown. Now, mind you, the crown are worn by kings who are male. But essentially, the power behind the crowns are the women. So in a way, I'm countering the narrative by actually placing the crowns on women sometimes rather than the men, because the power is shared by the two genders. Well, I can see that your image from the Egyptian era is actually reminiscent of what I'm doing right now. Yes, essentially, because the woman is wearing a crown too.
Exactly.
Yes,
yeah.
And it's about women.
So now are these crowns made out of organic material? I mean, are those real flowers in these crowns? Or is it a combination of organic and inorganic? Yeah,
well,
what is the materiality?
I made my own kind of organic crown.
Yeah.
The flowers are quite different. But I'm a graphic artist, and sometimes I want to accentuate the crown and the woman. And at the same time, I'm interested in fashion, the power of editorial fashion, the power of the editorial image of women.
Right.
So, and I draw that parallel within my work because Gelede actually celebrates women. And in my work too, I try to draw a parallel to that. I celebrate womanhood. At the same time, I celebrate the men too. So the men are not.
Yeah, let's look at your celebration of a man here. This is such a fantastic image, and the colors are so rich and vibrant. So why in 2020, was this done during the pandemic?
It was done during the pandemic, and I
Amazing.
think yes, the Black figure there is actually a kind of recontextualization of a young African American popular model, Black model. I think I've forgotten his name right now, or let me just keep his name under wraps because I like that air of mystery around my work. But it's actually a remake of a fashion, a Black male fashion model. And I tried to redefine that as an image of being proud of the identity, your identity as a Black person, reframing the image of the Black male to essentially give some kind of pride.
Yeah, to think about this being produced in 2020
yes.
in this moment of tension, this is a beautiful celebration of the American Black male.
And I think it calls for that because when one is confronted by the same kind of news that we had at that time,
right?
The Trayvon, the guys who were killed, you know, and that continues every day. So one tries to look at that, and it arouses in you some kind of emotions that you'd like to actually put there.
Well, perhaps that's a good ending point for our discussion, and we could turn to some questions from the audience. It seems like there's a lot of interest in talking further about the Gelede masks.
Okay.
Let me see here. Yeah, Patricia Kimi has two questions, which I think I can combine. She writes, I would love to hear more about the messages that are conveyed by iconographic elements, such as the Gelede masks. Are the masks photographed by the artist, or are they sort of collage from existing images of masks? Are the masks drawn from museum collections? So yeah, are these masks that you know well? Are they in certain collections? How are you looking at them as three-dimensional objects when you're painting them, or are you looking at them as photos?
Yeah, I'm looking at them as photos. I like, you know what I said the other time? A lot of these masks are in the collections of the Western museums. And I wanted to reclaim that. So I do take some of these masks from their collections to actually bring into focus and into the conversation the wrongful appropriation of these images by these museums and to reclaim that. So I use photographs from the internet. I look at the collections of the museums and I take objects from there to reclaim and to appropriate in a way.
So then Brenda G. Williams writes, I love the majestic works. The Gelede probably an older culture than European monarchy, yet regally dressed Gelede did or does not command the same respect as a European monarch, though they are both monarchs. So this idea that both the masks and the portrait figures are monarchy from different regions, from different times. And then she goes on, once the mask is put in this image, you can recognize that they represent the same hierarchy and status. So I think that's not a question, but it's a fascinating statement that Brenda is seeing that you're providing the Gelede mask and Elizabeth, or the female monarch with the same status. Is that something you're thinking about in these works?
Yeah, in a way, because it's to actually challenge this kind of singular historical narrative. That's what I tried to do. It's a challenge to the singular narrative. But at the same time, I think these pictures could be looked at as images independent of the two cultures I'm actually borrowing from. And if we were to look at this new images. It's more of like some kind of fantasy again at the same time, some new kind of hybridized creature. And what are the kind of interesting questions and answers that one can even derive from these images, irrespective of where they are taken from. So, like I said, I wanted to induce new conversations about race itself, about stories of race itself, about stories of cultures themselves. Because if we are to look at it very well, we are all the same. We are all the same. We are all from the same source, So, in a way, that's what I tried to do.
Right.
How can one look at these images themselves as independent images of women, some new kind of woman, and the kind of power,
a universal woman.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, Brenda, you're thinking right there. And then from Mark Evan Davis, and I see your questions, Noemi. We're almost there. He writes, I'm struck not just by how jarring the juxtaposition of African masks with Baroque European figures is initially, but also by how natural it looks in some ways. That makes me wonder what drew the artist, what drew Wole to Baroque imagery especially, what connects these ostensibly different visual elements. Yeah, that's at the heart of this interview, which we haven't actually gotten to. So thank you, Mark. Leah, why did you turn to these images? In particular, actually, one of my major questions was why Elizabeth too? Why this moment in the 1580s?
When I started making the pictures, I was, like I said, I was drawn to this kind of debate about women of color being marginalized in fashion, models being marginalized. And I think one of the first images that I did at that time was to actually superimpose the masks. Like I said, I've always been excited or interested in Gelede masks. It's about women, and something just drew me to superimposing these masks onto images of women in Western fashion to question.
Yeah, and I think what's so striking too about this moment of Elizabeth, I can't say Elizabethan fashion. I mean, I study like 1530s, and it's a different time. You see a different part of the female body, but these portraits are completely, head to toe, neck covered. I mean, so what's so striking, especially in this image, is that the mask fits like on top of the collar. So you do not see the body. The body is encased in like an armor of fabric. So it's a fascinating moment to choose.
So I was going to say something. When I started making the images, the first set of images were of like contemporary fashion models, like Kate Moss,
Right.
And by and by, I began to be drawn into the history of fashion itself. I began to actually see that the images of the Western female may not be contemporary, may be traditional.
Right.
So I began to look into that, and I felt drawn to that. I don't understand why, but like I said, it's like the history of fashion itself. It's like the history and images of fashionable women.
Mm-hmm.
And if one were to look at that, it wasn't so out of the way for me to start thinking like that and to start putting these masks onto the women. I wanted to do two things, either superimpose or actually ask you, are the women wearing the masks themselves?
Right. Are they
wearing it?
Yeah. How do you answer that?
Well, it's there. Some of the images that don't actually have the skin showing will actually give you some new kind of story.
Yeah, that's what's so shocking about this one in particular. So
Some have
okay.
gloves on the hand, so you can't actually know
Exactly, the skin color. Mm-hmm.
in color. So in some ways, it was a challenge, and I felt that I could do that, and I could elicit some kind of new conversation. And I didn't have any preconceived notion of what these conversations may be, but I just wanted to hear them.
Right.
And
create them.
Yeah, and create them.
So we have a great question here from Reginald. And actually, I think I will stop share because then we can look at the paintings in your background a little bit better. Reginald Jackson writes, "Thank you so much for the stimulating conversation. I love your style." Exclamation mark. "I'm always intrigued by artists' choice of medium and its significance. Looking at your more recent oil paintings, the flatter treatment, planes of color, tends to feel more like gouache and less highly modeled, reflective than classical oil. Could you talk about how and when you decided to use oil or acrylic and the goal or politics of juxtaposing more 2D and 3D elements in a single painting?" So that's a lot of questions. So first he wants to know about your medium, and I would love to know too. He says that these are oil paintings and they have a flatter treatment. And he just wants to know how you've developed into that. And he also wants to know about this 2D, 3D element going on here.
Well, that could be wrong, because if one were to actually look at my paintings, the oil paintings, they're actually textured. There's so much texture in there. And that's what I like people to do. I like to invite people to actually see these paintings in real life. There's so much texture in there. And I actually did that because the kind of textures I got from acrylic, if you look at the older paintings, they were done in acrylic. The more recent paintings are done in oil, and they're quite textured. So I like to actually clarify that. The other one was at a certain time, I began to see that if I actually use symbols, people may not understand them very well. But if I were to actually make three-dimensional paintings or take three-dimensional imagery, people could relate them to the objects in the museums. I mean, you don't need much. If you see a photograph of a Gelede mask in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum, and you see that same mask treated as a three-dimensional object in my painting, it doesn't take much for you to you'll be able to locate where these objects were taken from. That was essentially what I wanted to do.
I see that Reginald has a quick follow-up. And what does the watery, bleeding material of ink allow you to express about portraiture that wasn't available with oil or acrylic? So he sees this looser quality.
Those are my drawings.
Your drawings, yeah, which we didn't talk about today. I'm sorry.
Those are my drawings. And that's some kind of daily exercise I like to do. After working so much on paintings for a period of time, I like to just relax, and when I'm relaxing, I like to draw.
So making paintings is not relaxing.
It's not. There's some days the weather is not so good. You don't really feel like doing some tedious work, although drawing too can be sometimes tedious. But sometimes I just like to draw, And
Right.
I think those kind of paintings or drawings, as the case may be, are things that you can see within the minutes. You can see them in a day. These paintings, before you can actually see the end point, may take 2 to 3 weeks. Mm-hmm. So the immediacy of the drawings actually attract me.
Right.
And the spontaneous thing, mm-hmm. the spontaneous imagery that you can bring about, because I don't have sketches for my drawings. I just draw freely.
Well, I wanted to ask you, I'm trying to look into your studio there at your painting, but it looks like, do you draw on your canvases? before you paint?
Yeah, I actually go outside and I make sketches.
You make sketches on the surface, yeah.
I make sketches. I have sketches that I make that I print out, you know. And so what I do is I like to graph these images onto the canvas. And sometimes I actually draw.
Onto the canvas, yeah.
You know, but when it comes to like placing the masks in a the correct proportion and the right way.
Right.
You need to have a sketch.
Do you, and I just another follow-up nerdy Renaissance art history question is, do you square your canvases? You square your drawings? Yeah.
Yes, I grid my
grid, yes, grid, yes.
Sometimes.
Yeah.
I like to use a projector. I have a very good one, but I like to grid. I like to read my drawings.
Yeah, and you save all your preparatory drawings. I hope you save everything.
I do save them.
Good. We need to see everything. Okay. I know Noemi has a ton of questions for you too. And I think rather than me read them, which would feel very silly, I will just invite her to join us in the conversation and she can ask her questions and we can move towards the conclusion. Thanks, Noemi.
Okay.
Of course, thank you so much. And I'm sorry that I have so many questions. I think we can drop the first question I had, the one about gender, because you've answered it beautifully in addressing other people's questions. But I wanted to ask you about two techniques that some of your paintings are deploying. So in some of your paintings, like of race mythology and redefinitions of storytelling, which we saw today, you are having white subjects don Yoruba masks, right? But in other paintings, like Reflections on Ori that we didn't see today, it's a 2019 painting, then you are inserting Black subjects, Black people, right, into Renaissance style paintings. And on that, Reflections on Ori is quite interesting because you can recognize that these are realistic facial feature of a sub-Saharan person, but they are multicolored. They have all sorts of patches of color on their faces. But I wanted to ask you about the difference or the complementarity between those two editing techniques, right? Those two ways of reworking the Baroque portrait. Is it different to insert a Yoruba mask versus inserting a Black person? And what different kinds of work do those insertions do?
You know, like what I wanted to do is to actually make people aware that there are people who wear these masks, you know? So at the same time, you like to feature the mask. At the same time, you like to feature the people, the personality behind the masks. So that's what I'd like to do. You know, I must have said it somewhere before. I wouldn't like my work to be pigeonholed around masks. I want my work to include a more complex and a much broader perspective and conversation. We're talking about masks. Yes, we are talking about the people who wear the mask. We're talking about the authority over the mask themselves. So it's a complete narrative. There are different features, there are different parts to the story. And the more I'm working, the more I'm bringing all these different narratives into play. It's just like the theater. Different roles, different personalities, different people. And at the end of the day, I like to look back and actually reflect on what I've done myself, because right now, I don't have a complete story. It's a continuous interrogation of my graphic background, my illustrative background, and like my painterly background, and my memories of growing up in Oshogu, and the kind of traditional activities, because Oshogu too is quite famous for the Oshun festival, which draws adherents from all over the diaspora and from all over the world. I grew up with that. So I'm interested in all those narratives, and I don't think I want to actually pigeonhole myself to a single level. So that's what I'm trying to do.
I love that you compared it to theater, because actually my second question was going in that direction. I wanted you, sorry, to tell us a little bit about the different kinds of media and art forms that inform your work. Obviously, fashion and design is central, but you just mentioned theatricality, and of course, some Yoruba masks are involved in ceremonies and performance practices, so there is a strong performance dimension there. So I just wanted to hear, because I'm obsessed with theater and performance specifically.
I'll tell you why,
but it doesn't have to be limited to it. Thank you.
Okay. When I was growing up, I grew up in Oshogu. There was also the traveling theater in Western Nigeria. The traveling theater, you will see that these practitioners, they will have a big van or lorry, and they will travel from town to town, having theatrical performances for the people. And one of these actors, his name is Wole Lagunju. If you search for him on the internet, you will be able to read about him. One of the most talented theater practitioners in Western Nigeria. I grew up around Wole Lagunju because his theater was next door to my father's shop. On one side was the gallery, the Newberry Gallery of Art. On one side was the theatrical company of Wole Lagunju. So when I'm returning from school in the afternoon and I branch to my father's shop, I will be looking through his office window into the performative arena of Wole Lagunju. And these were like the biggest theater companies in Western Nigeria at that time. So I grew up around that. And I have that kind of background because the Oshogu Art School, a lot of the painters actually function also as theatrical performers, yes. They performed in plays. They were all over the whole country. Some even traveled outside the country to the Western countries to engage in performances. So I grew up around that. And I think in a way that has rubbed off me too, in some ways, in the kind of imaginative kind of experiences that I like to share in my work.
Thank you. I love it. I know that Leah has some plans, but I have one more question that I want to sneak in before we move on. You have told us, and this is something that you and I have talked about earlier when we first met, how important it is for you to start conversations, right? This is what you want your work to do, rather than provide answers or make statements or thesis about history and race and how all of this works together and draw direct lines of conclusion. You want to start conversations by putting forward those wonderfully evocative and powerful images, and that conjure up narratives and different narratives for each of us. So I'd be curious to hear about the conversations that have actually emerged. How have people responded to your artwork? How have critics taken up the work that you're doing in response to the Baroque Visual Archive?
Yes, I've had a lot of feedback from people, and I've had a lot of stories, and you might see that from you yourself now, I'm getting some kind of stories too. So people are curious, and that's what I wanted to do in the first place. I wanted to conjure up these conversations and for people to get interested in these perspectives of the traditional woman power and gender in Africa. And I think what I've been able to experience is that there is some kind of new conversations and new kind of questioning that you don't normally get, when you actually portray Gelede masks as just objects in contemporary African art, and that's it. But making these hybridized images has made people more knowledgeable in a way, from my experience, about masks, about women, about traditional societies, about power in the traditional societies, about gender, about Yoruba society, about Africa. So I've had that experience, and I've had those kind of questioning, which has broadened, I think, the knowledge of the audience.
Great. We have another good question from Reginald, which, and then I just have a few concluding questions as well. He says, how does he put it? He puts it better. I mean, essentially, what do you look for or appreciate most in artists these days, technically or conceptually? So I guess he's within that question, he's asking you, what other artists are you looking at? What inspires you in the art world?
That's a difficult one. Because over the years, I've outgrew my crutches. You know, I had a lot of crutches at a certain time. You know, we all need crutches at a certain point in our life. You know, and for every artist, you need your artistic crutches. People you look up to, artists you look up to. And I think over the years, I've outgrew that, because a lot of the, I won't name names, a lot of the Western artists that I look up to, you know, I've had cause to look at their practice and to actually see that would these artists be deemed great artists if they had had kind of competition which they should have had from artists with different cultural backgrounds. You know, I've done my research and I look at some of the artists that I grew up with, or artists from that side of the world, and I will compare their years. I will compare, like, maybe 1945. What do you see a Western artist being able to achieve? And what do you see an artist in Africa being able to achieve at the same time? And that difference is so, the gap is so wide, you know. And I couldn't just consider myself looking at artists in the Western world as the kind of artist I look up to. You know, that was a question. I started to question that, are these artists supposed to be as great as this if they had kind of competition they were supposed to have from artists from other parts of the world? So I started outgrowing that, you know. So I don't look to too many artists now as, but I do have some preferences if I look at it very well.
That makes sense. And just as a final question,
okay,
we were just looking outward, thinking about critics and other artists, but how would you define yourself? I mean, would you consider yourself a Black Baroque artist? Could you adapt, you know, use that title? And I'd like to hear a little bit about your exhibition too coming up, or your gallery show, and what you're presenting there, and you can tell us more about it, how we can come see it. And so, yeah, tell us how you define yourself at this moment, which is so exciting to do.
I define myself as a diaspora person, a kind of cultural ambassador, an in-between person, somebody who is caught in between cultures, who is just trying to make sense of it all. You know, because when you leave your space, you know, I moved to the United States in 2007, you know, and when I left my space, you know, I found myself in a global space again, and I had to like reconfigure, reinvent, and start looking at some of the issues that I've looked at in my life. I had to start looking at them all over again. I had to start finding myself. So in a way, I'm still finding myself. Every day I wake up, I'm still finding myself, you know? So it's a different ballgame entirely. When you find yourself in a different culture, when you look out of your window, you still have to like place yourself in and wake up to what you're doing. So I just see myself as someone who is kind of reacting to the kind of space I found myself and trying to make sense of it all. Your other question?
Just tell us more about your gallery show and when it's opening. It's in New York?
The gallery show started, and I'm having it in New York. It started on the 5th of May when I was there. And it's still going on now until the 18th, I believe, of June.
Okay, so we have time.
Yeah.
We gotta get there.
So my new show is entirely an intersection, I would say, an intersection between cosmology, Yoruba cosmology, fashion, and contemporary African art. You know, that's where I find myself situating my practice right now, and a lot of new work there.
I wish we could all go. We'll have to make. They hope they make a video of the display in case, you know, for those of us who can't make it to New York in the next month. But this is.
It'll go on Instagram.
It'll go on Instagram. Okay, you put the works on Instagram. Okay, everybody should follow him. Wole on Instagram.
It's on Artsy too. Artsy.
Okay, on Artsy. Great. Well, thank you so much. This has been amazing. It's been such a pleasure talking to you and learning more about your incredible work. I'm very grateful. I think I'll just turn it over now to Noemi, who will make some concluding remarks, but thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you both. You gave us so much to think about. I'm really grateful to both of you. There was so much food for thought. And I think, you know, if I were to pick up just a couple of highlights from this conversation for me, the first thing would have to do with the question of gender, right? And I love the unexpected resonances between the tradition of the Gelede mask, whose power, as you said, Wole, lies in the to and fro between the masculinity of the male bearer, the male mask bearer, and the femininity of what the mask represents, right? This is a space of in-betweenness, of conversation, and that's where power lies. There is actually an unexpected resonance between that tradition and representations of Elizabeth I herself, who is this icon that you keep engaging with over and over again. Since Elizabeth was drawing her own power from a to and fro between her own femininity and the masculinity of her body politic as a prince, as a sovereign prince that could only be imagined as male at the time. So I just love that. I will say I still loved how you showed us the affordances for Black artists today, for Black Baroque artists today. I'll stick to that label.
Well, some people have referred to my work as futurism too, Afrofuturism.
I'm not surprised. I can totally see it. But you show us the affordances for Black Baroque artists of engaging, who are engaging in revisionist practices, of engaging Renaissance iconography holistically, right? And not just images of the Black in the pre-modern world, right? We can reclaim it all. We can revision it all. And I thought that was a really, really exciting line of thinking there. And finally, going back to Leah's observations about the incredible bright palette that you are using throughout, I was also struck along the same lines by the presence of the natural imagery, right? There are leaves and flowers and animals everywhere. And it's quite striking to me that, you know, those techniques, those schemes, put some life back into those old dusty portraits, suggesting that they too, in a way, are organic entities that are bound to grow and to transform possibly into something else in the hands of talented artists. So this was an exhilarating conversation and really great closing for this spring slate of Black Baroque Project events. I want to thank our speakers again. Please join me in giving them a round of applause. And the recording of today's event is going to be available on the YouTube channel of the Black Baroque project shortly. I think Rachel, yes, thank you, Rachel, for dropping the link into the chat. So please feel free to check out the channel. If you're curious about previous conversations we have hosted on this series, you will find a conversation between painter Kajal Benis and art historian Cecilio Cooper. You'll find conversations between choreographer Bintu Dembele and musicologist Martha Feldman, conversations between director and actress Deborah Ann Bird and theater scholar and director Gabrielle Randall Bent, as well as a conversation between playwright and actor Keith Hamilton Cobb and yours truly. So our YouTube channel is there for you. And finally, please stay tuned. We will return in the fall for more Black Baroque conversations. We are cooking up a really great slate of events. So we hope you will join us there. Thank you and take care. Thanks again, Leah and Wole. Talk to you soon.
Thank you.